Welcome. Today we're going to take a look at characterization, which pertains to the way that writers create characters for stories. So, characterization has to deal with the choices that writers make when they're creating interesting characters in stories, poetry, plays, screenplays, novels, short stories, all of it. So anytime that we're working with a story and we want to include a character, we're going to use different writing techniques to put this character on the page so that the character makes sense to our reader. Kinds of things that we're going to do there will include dialogue, such as the way that the character speaks, the way that the character interacts with other characters, actions, in particular the way that we're going to describe the actions of our character, and of course it'll be telling the types of actions that the character takes. Speech, such as the way that the character speaks, whether the character uses kind of more academic language or more professional language, or whether the person uses a simpler form of language. We're also going to talk about gestures, the kind of movements that the character would make within a story. All of these things go into characterization, which is creating that character within the story. Now, we definitely have different ways that we can create a character and different types of characters that go into each story. So primary characters, these are our main characters in a piece of fiction. And I've got some examples here. We can look at like Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. These are all from the Harry Potter stories, and these are primary characters because the stories are about those characters throughout all of the books. Now, secondary characters are also included in the books, but they have a very different purpose. So with primary characters, those characters are driving the story forward. They're making the story happen. But with the secondary character, they're actually supporting the primary characters. Some examples from the Harry Potter books would be Dean Thomas, Seamus Finnegan, Parvati Patil, and Lavender Brown. These characters all sit in the background. They definitely add to the story, but they don't have the same level of importance to the plot, to the story, and they don't change as much over time. They're not as vital as our main characters, as our primary characters. Now, with our protagonist, typically you're going to have at least one protagonist, although sometimes you may have a couple, especially with a story that has a lot of characters. But we can find our protagonist. This is sometimes just called the good guy or the good person, right? So this is your main character. This is the character that's going to do a lot of the action. They're going to partake in the action, the activity that's happening within the plot of the story. This character is a key decision maker. The kinds of decisions that the protagonist makes are very important. And this is the character who really faces the obstacles that are involved in that conflict. So the things that are happening in the story, the protagonist is definitely involved in. Now we've got the antagonist. So the antagonist is sometimes seen as being against the protagonist. It's the character who oftentimes opposes the protagonist, sometimes referenced in a simple way by saying the bad guy. This is the character that the protagonist has to deal with in some way. Either they have to overcome them, or they have to go around them, or they have to dispose of them, or something. So some examples from the Harry Potter stories would include Lord Voldemort, Draco Malfoy, and Dolores Umbridge. These are all antagonists and are all in the way of Harry Potter in some way and the other main characters. But the way that they're managed, the way that they're dealt with on the page is very different. We also have dynamic characters. Dynamic characters are very important. With dynamic characters, these are characters that change or develop over the course of the story. They're usually the protagonist. So if we look at the Harry Potter characters, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, those are the characters that change the most throughout the series of books. They'll change physically, intellectually, emotionally, and in other ways too. And at least part of this overall story is going to be dedicated to the dynamic character's transformation. So those characters do have to change in some way. If you don't create dynamic characters, what you're creating are flat characters, and flat characters are very difficult for your reader to have a close connection to. It's harder for a reader to understand a flat character. They're unlike humans because they don't change, they stay the same. So examples of our dynamic characters include the protagonists of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but also include Draco. Draco does experience a couple of changes and one particularly strong change at the end of the stories. Now, in contrast to the dynamic characters, you also have static characters. Your static characters don't change. They're pretty much the same people at the end of the story as they were back at the beginning of the story. So the purpose of the static characters is like your secondary characters. They're in the story to support the main characters, okay? Some examples from the Harry Potter stories would be Vincent Crabbe, Gregory Doyle, and then the characters Fred and George Weasley. These characters serve different roles within these overall stories, but they don't change significantly. For the most part, they're still the same people that at the end of the story as they were at the beginning, and they're really there to support and to create that kind of background and that foundation for your main characters, for your protagonists. So something you want to take into consideration as a writer is to really build up your characters. One of the things you really want to do is to put your characters into situations that will reveal their character, that will allow them to face adversity and grow over the course of the story. This can be pretty challenging because sometimes we just really like our characters, and so it's hard for us to put them into hard situations. But when we put them into difficult situations, that's where they are able to grow and develop as characters and become different across the span of the story. And that's important to happen for our stories. So there are two different kinds of stories, the way that you can design them. One is your character-driven stories, and the other are the plot-driven stories. So with your character-driven stories, they push the stories forward. They drive the stories forward so that the stories are really happening because of the characters, because of what those characters bring to the story and how they change and how they develop throughout the course of the story. So, little information there about characters and about characterization. I hope that's helpful to you.